Good evening, and thank you for coming to this session on this strange beast that is sometimes called a reader's editor, sometimes called an ombudsman, sometimes called a public editor. I'm Alan Rusbridger. I used to edit The Guardian, and when I was made the editor of The Guardian, I remember being slightly freaked out by the power that an editor had, and also by the sheer number of complaints that used to come in. And the complete absence of any kind of mechanism to deal openly and fairly with those complaints. I think on most newspapers you have a character who sometimes calls themselves managing editor, whose job really is to manage those complaints away. I started on The Guardian in 1997, an office that we called Reader's Editor. A man called Ian Mays, who had been working on The Guardian, took that role. And I can't tell you the sense of relief I had that, first of all, I didn't have to deal with all these appalling people who were complaining. I used to just send them off to Ian. And a sense that actually this was natural and it was right. And it was what was happening in any other walk of life. That if I was responsible for something that was wrong in The Guardian, it was not really a correct procedure that I should sit in judgment on whether it was wrong or right. It was much better to have somebody else who you could say, look, you judge whether this needs correcting or whether we've breached our ethical framework in some kind of way. I will give you a space in the paper every day. I'll give you a space in the paper every week. And you are the hinge between the reader and the paper. I have never regretted doing that. It seemed to me something that I thought every newspaper would adapt. I met some of the people around this table at various conferences in Istanbul and Harvard, and it seemed like this was a kind of movement. But it never really quite worked out like that, I think mainly because of newsroom cuts. I think maybe part of the story is social media as well, and editors thinking, well, we don't need to do that now because it's done for us by social media. But nevertheless, I think it is still a very interesting model. And this evening we've got four really interesting and experienced people to tell us about their own experiences. In a minute, I'm going to start with Kathy, who recently spent some time at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, actually writing a learned paper, which we've persuaded her not to show tonight, because otherwise she would show the rest of us up for having done her homework in ways that we haven't. I'm then going to ask Anna, who was the, what was your title?
I was the public editor.
She was the public editor at La Stampa. And a very experienced one who has also spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the role. Then we're going to Yavuz on the end, who was part of that conference in Istanbul in 2007. 2004, it was 2007 in Harvard. And I now think of that conference as maybe the high watermark of public editors, and there's the story, of course, of press freedom in Turkey. It hasn't been so good since. And then we're going to end up with Kyle, who's done such interesting work at the Columbia Journalism Review in terms of thinking of the office and how that office can work on behalf of other organizations. So I think if each panelist will maybe speak to three to 5 minutes, something like that. Is that what you were told? Yes, good. We will then have a discussion here amongst ourselves, but I very much hope in the spirit of the public editor that you, the public, will want to make a contribution. There was a clever app at the last session we did, but apparently we haven't got a clever app. So if you want to say something or contribute, please come up, either bellow from where you are, or come up here and speak into the microphone there. So please be braced for making this an interactive session. Kathy, why don't you kick off?
Thank you, Alan. Well,
Sorry, there we go. I did that in the last one. And then, as Alan said, last year I had the immense privilege of spending some time at the Reuters Institute to examine the potential and the possibilities of the role and what is needed now. So I started out with some core questions. Who holds journalists to account for ethical, accurate, and fair journalism? And who ensures that the journalists in your newsroom and in your community get it right and abide by journalism's professional standards? This is really about accountability. And as an industry, journalism has had a hard time with accountability. We're the industry that says we hold the powerful to account, but don't question us, don't ask us any questions. That is an attitude that really undermines trust in journalism, I think. Why should someone trust journalists who weigh in on that issue with such hypocrisy? So my argument in looking at the role was that with the crises in trust in journalism, with the reckoning, the issues related to diversity and inclusion in journalism, the role has never been more important, that it's time to rethink it, to determine what can this role be. So, what is a public editor anyway? As Alan said, it goes by several names. In many European broadcast organizations, it's the news ombudsman, it's the reader's editor at The Guardian, a public editor many places in the US and Canada. There are only 4 public editors in Canada, probably even less in the US right now. It's definitely what I would call an endangered species. Both Yavuz and I belong to the Organization of News Ombudsmen, which, if you think about the acronym, it's "Oh no," because that's what we say when people, all those readers come to us, "Oh no." The organization has been going since 1972. This is not a new movement, and yet there are still only about 60 public editors, ombudsmen, readers' editors in the world. So it's a job that never really took off in journalism for lots and lots of reasons. I did the role at the Toronto Star for 13 years. The Toronto Star had a really solid commitment to the role. It was independent, reports to the publisher, a column, much the same way as at The Guardian. The Toronto Star also had a strong commitment to what I called radical transparency and accountability. In its journalistic standards manual, it has a statement that says, "We should be prepared to explain publicly what we do in all our journalistic decision-making." And it was my role to do that explaining to the public. Over the course of the 13 years, I corresponded with more than 150,000 readers, complaints, concerns, a few kudos now and then, but you really get a sense of the public misunderstanding of journalism. And the role itself can be a form of media literacy as well. So, I came to, what is an ideal public editor? Well, the ideal job has to be independent, and that independence has to be established either by the board, the CEO, the publisher. The person who takes it on has to be fiercely independent and be willing to take on everyone in the newsroom, including the editor-in-chief. And I think all of us who've done the job know that that's not always easy, and we don't always rise to that occasion. But I will also argue that the job is totally connected to the imperatives of trustworthy journalism. All of the things that we know, all the various trust projects, Sally Lerman's here from the Trust Project. The trust initiatives have established imperatives of what we would know as trustworthy journalism: accurate, fair. Do you make distinctions between news and opinion? Those are the things that news ombudsmen, public editors do. They uphold those things. So in preparing for my project, I circulated a questionnaire to the 60 news ombudsmen from around the world and said, what do you do? Do you see your job as connected to trust? every single one, 100% saw their job, that their first job was upholding newsroom trust and all the imperatives that go into newsroom trust. They regarded their roles as essential in communicating with readers the elements of trustworthy journalism and helping readers understand. At the time I was doing my fellowship at Reuters, we were having lots and lots of discussions in the wake of George Floyd in the US, this reckoning in journalism, this understanding that, you know, as an industry, we'd also fallen short on diversity, both in content and in staffing. We had a lot of discussions about who has a voice in journalism, who has a seat at the table. So I began to also look at, is there a role for the public editor to play in upholding diversity? And came to some really interesting research. Again, I asked the question, like, why have we failed? Why has journalism failed for 50 years as an industry to come to terms with diversity? And that's probably more of a North American thing, as I know less about Europe. Anna, you can talk about that maybe. But we looked at, you know, could the public editor role, if accountability is what the role is, could it also play a role in upholding accountability for diversity, for inclusion, both in content particularly, explaining why don't we have diverse voices in this story? Why do we go to the same old people to comment over and over again? Why don't we have diverse sources? That should be part of the role as well. That's less a part of the role as it exists now, and so in my paper I talked about, you know, the journalistic imagination that, you know, we have to invent it. We have to sort of say, what's the potential? What's the possibility? What should a public editor be doing now? And a public editor should be doing anything that's related to trust, and certainly diversity, diverse voices are a core part of trust, and certainly as the Trust Project outlines it. So I came to the conclusion that a strong, independent, proactive publics editor would question the status quo of journalism, criticize news coverage that perpetuates inequality, examine reasons why inequality is part of our journalism, and ended my paper, which you're free to look at on the Reuters website, with a job description for the job. So as I did this, it was sort of like, is this a blue sky thing? Could this exist? And the week after my paper was published, I was on Twitter and I saw a journalist from Philadelphia by the name of Tauhid Chappell, whom we invited to participate in this panel, and Tauhid couldn't make it. Tauhid tweeted, successfully pitched a public editor media column to generosity. Long live the ombudsman. And he wrote in an article that he linked to, in the past, greater number of newspapers had public editors who worked on behalf of the public, holding media institutions accountable and investigating readers' grievances about coverages. Their presence and service has been greatly diminished by media companies, but I believe that in a city like Philadelphia, we need to have more public editors that hold media corporations accountable for their actions and move them to directly address racism within their organization. So Tauhid and I were able to communicate. I said, I just wrote that this should happen, and you're doing it. And it just was one of those ideas, those things where an idea is coming from two different places. So I'll just conclude with Tauhid's words, long live the ombudsman, long live the public editor, but we need to reinvent it, but we do need it.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And since we're meeting privately, and there are a lot of very discreet people here, do you want to give us just one example of an occasion where it was difficult to maintain your independence?
Oh. It's difficult to maintain your independence when the CEO has views on a topic. And I can't go into specifics, but I would say that there were times where you, as a public editor, you feel the pressure. You feel the pressure to deliver what they want, and I hope my colleagues, I assume they've felt this too, but there is pressure to hold on to your independence, to be fierce about it.
I mean, the Toronto newspaper is a great the Toronto Star is a great newspaper, and I'm sure you work for great editors. But I know even have all that I said about public editors, readers' editors, sometimes you're furious with them. You think this is so unfair that they can't see why we published this great article, and now they're going to criticize me in public, and the temptation is to strangle them, frankly. But even if you don't strangle them, so that must have happened to you occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, we had, for most of my tenure, there was a very strong editor-in-chief who, made no bones about the fact that there were times that he just didn't like my column. He never did move to try and kill it in any way, but there was an instance where I called out a columnist for something that a reader had deemed to be racist. I agreed with the reader. I wrote a column about it, and the columnist, a marquee columnist, was furious, absolutely furious, to the point of seeking out a lawyer to find out if she could sue me for it. So yeah, you don't make friends in the job. It's not for nothing that it's called the loneliest job in the newsroom.
Fantastic. Anna.
Okay, thank you. So that happened to me, but I always gave a chance to the journalist to explain the error.
Of course.
So, I mean, I never wrote a column without the journalists knowing about it, and I always ran the column to the journalists to see if they wanted to react before I published it. Did you do that?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Because I think that's important. It's not like public editors shouldn't be there to run tricks against the journalists. They should just try to be fair and to try to explain in a transparent way to the readers what happened in the newsroom, what mishap happened. So I considered my role as public editor a little bit as, I don't know if you're familiar with Pinocchio, the story. I always felt like I was the talking cricket, the talking cricket? Yeah, the talking cricket in Pinocchio always says, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and always sort of nagging Pinocchio, and Pinocchio wants to just crush him. So that's how I felt the role. And I think the person who inspired my work was Margaret Sullivan, because actually I became public editor the year that she quit at the New York Times. And she was here at the Journalism Festival, and I talked to her, and she actually, told me, do it your own way, because, I mean, in Italy, there was no public edit, no precedent. So I was inventing a role completely, like cutting it for myself. I was proposing the role in my newspaper, and coming back from an experience that I had been on a leave of absence. I used to be the web editor and the social media editor of my newspaper, and I was the first one, both first web editor in Italy and first social media editor in Italy. So it was kind of natural for me to decide to look for something innovative. And after a leave of absence, I was away for 2 years. And when I came back, there was no role for me anymore, because they already had substituted me both at the web and at social media. And so I decided to invent the public editor role in Italy. And but it wasn't really truly the Anglo-Saxon public editor. I did not belong to the Association of Ombudsmen. I never subscribed, because I would have had to pay with my own money, because my publisher didn't even know it existed. And plus, I did not, my boss was my editor-in-chief, so I was a journalist. My boss was not the publisher. I mean, of course, the publisher owns the newspaper, but I mean, I reported to the editor-in-chief just like any other journalist. I was a senior editor, so I reported directly to the editor-in-chief. But every time, so the editor-in-chief accepted to give me the role and decided to bet on this role, so was very courageous, but said, never, you come to me first. You never publish anything without my approval. So it was a battle every week. I had a weekly column. I was public editor daily in terms of answering daily to the readers who wrote the letters. So I answered all the letters, the emails, and I answered on social media, because I was more social media oriented. And so I answered in public. And then I had a weekly column. I decided to have a weekly column, and it was, in the beginning, it was paper and online. Then eventually, all the readers' material of La Stampa went on digital. It became digital first. And so, which meant no more letters of the readers on the newspaper, because there's no room. They cut the number of pages, and so it all goes online, and so I just edited online, and my column went online, and it wasn't on the paper anymore. It was a way to sort of get rid of me, in the sense that they got annoyed at my paper column, because the paper column was seen in politics. In Italy, politicians read the newspaper, the paper version, because they have the press, they get free papers on their desk every morning. So it kind of annoyed the editor-in-chief and the journalists to have the politicians in the parliament reading about the errors they made. So they hoped that if they went online, no one would read it. Actually, it was the other way around, of course, because it went on social media, and all politicians are on social media, so everybody saw it. It became much more visible, actually. And in the meantime, I changed 3 editors-in-chief. I was there. I was public editor for 7 years, and I had 3 different editors-in-chief in the meantime. So the first one is the one who accepted the job, said, okay, do it. And then he left and went to another newspaper, which was Mario Calabresi. And so I found myself with Maurizio Molinari, who is now the editor-in-chief of La Repubblica. And Mario Calabresi left La Repubblica. And now there's another editor-in-chief, the one that I retired with last year. And he comes from La Repubblica, and he had no idea why I was there being a public editor. He had no use of it, because he never really wanted it, and he didn't even care about digital first. He was very more traditional. So I found myself in a place where I was doing something that nobody in the newspaper wanted in the end. In the beginning, they did, and they were curious about it. They were curious, and they got annoyed sometimes, but in the end, I was soft on them, because I knew I had to live with my colleagues, and as Kathy says, it can be hard, but I had to tread on thin ice. I had to tread on thin ice. I had to balance things out. What I was doing an act of transparency. In the meantime, and I see Sally Lerman here from the Trust Project, I was doing also the work for the Trust Project. We were trying to bring the Trust Project in the newspaper. So it was very useful that there was a public editor, because I was the one in charge of also bringing this project in. And that didn't work out very much either. But basically, my job was to explain to the readers the errors in a transparent way, but find a way to excuse and justify the errors. So basically, I was trying to, my role became, it evolved in a role where I said, okay, so this is why this error happened. Dear reader, let me explain to you. We know people are human, they make mistakes, it can happen. So one thing is a small, writing typo. Another thing is a factual error, where you make a mistake in terms of being ignorant about a date of something, or a capital of a city, or saying something historical that happened in a completely different way than what really happened, because you're ignorant and you're not checking, you're not doing any fact checking when you're writing. And that happens a lot in newspapers, both on the paper and online, but especially online, because online, the newsrooms are really in a rush, and so there's no fact-checking and there's no copy editing. So it just goes on, whatever someone writes goes online without any proof in Italy. That's what happens. So of course, the errors there are huge. But I never corrected really the online errors, because those are correctable. So what I did is I corrected the errors and put a transparent note at the end saying this copy was wrong, we corrected it, this is the right version. So I did that kind of corrections. I only corrected the paper versions, because the paper versions weren't correctable. So if in the paper we wrote something wrong, and mostly, unfortunately, it wasn't just typos or factual errors, it was clickbait headlines, really bad headlines that said the opposite of what the article said, or lack of diversity, so complete explainers that were written in a way that was totally not very partial and not fair. And so to bring back fairness, I wrote a column, saying, asking the journalists to be more fair. So it was a lot of work, a lot of convincing, a lot of fighting, a lot of trying to find the way to convince the journalist that he or she would look better and have more credibility and have a better reputation if he or she corrected and decided to accept the mistake and say, it's on me, I made a mistake, I was in a rush, or my editor asked me something and I misinterpreted, and in the end it came out as an unfair article, but actually this is better, and so he accepted to correct. But that was very hard to reach, and very often I didn't get that. I told the readers, I told the readers how things were. So I'd say, I think this article is unfair, and I would always find an excuse in terms of having readers on my side asking me to do it. Like I would need first the readers to ask me on social media, Anna, you should go and correct this because this is a terrible article and it doesn't, it's not up to the standards of the Stampa. So I would go to my editor-in-chief and said, the readers are asking me to intervene, what should we do? And we would have a long debate about it, and eventually we'd find a compromise solution, and I would respond to the readers and write the column with both versions, saying the readers ask this, the editor-in-chief says this, the journalist who wrote the article says this, and this is what I say in the end. So I would do this kind of steps, which is something that Margaret used to do too. I mean, so I tried to find my own role. I mean, I wasn't an engagement editor, but I did engage readers a lot, because mostly I did a lot, when it wasn't in a column, it was mostly a lot on Twitter and on social media, discussing with readers and replying. So there was a lot of social media discussions going on. And now that I'm not there, it's kind of fun to have to say, I admit that I kind of enjoy the fact that readers are saying that they miss me. So when I left, yeah, which is kind of nice.
You mentioned Margaret Sullivan, who I'm a huge admirer of as well. Some people thought that she was so good and so sharp and so on everything that her voice almost became bigger than the editor's. She became the brand. Do you have a view on that?
And signals to other countries where populism was on the rise, showing those kind of leaders, populist leaders, either to bend or shackle the media, to proceed to the open gates to an autocracy. The more successful these leaders took control of the media, the easier it became for them to tighten the order, and the self-regulation of the media in the form of public editors becomes one of the major elements lost in transition. So is the case there. And as Alan mentioned, in early millennium years, we were all full of hope. It was a movement, clearly visible, but things turned south since then. The thing imploded in full in Turkey. Public editor is now out of radar. My argument is threefold. First, the destiny and the well-being of the media in any country, except in purely totalitarian regimes, is tightly synced and linked with the independence of its judiciary, and to the extent how pro-pluralistic, pro-freedom this judiciary is in terms of media. And once the judiciary starts losing this existential feature, as such, exposes targets the fourth estate first, journalism. It becomes a vulnerable target as a sector as well. And hardcore autocrats know this, and Turkey's Erdogan realized it, studying meticulously Putin, his patterns, that the key to capture media, beyond buying off the corrupt media proprietors, was to conquer the judges and high courts and use all this power to corrupt everything around themselves. Second point, the more interventionist and restrictive the political executive is, it makes the self-regulation and accountability efforts of the media not harder, but makes it a waste of energy in a way, as they say in English, plowing the water. Third, in traditionally self-restrictive media environments, where the journalism culture is sort of torn between the obedience to various forms of power and pure nationalism, which is clearly the case in Turkish media, and this at one hand, and the other, sheer militancy in terms of, in the sense of instrumentalizing journalism for a fierce political battle in polarized environments. Sensible debates in such environments, work ethics becomes a struggle in vain, in a sense. In the past 20 years, when I had adopted the role of the first ombudsman, first news ombudsman in Turkey, that was a job that lasted for about 15 years. I have built up a memory of the scope of hostilities to journalism. I was appointed in January 1999, slightly after the first ombudsman in the Guardian, by the newspaper management. It was Milliyet Daily, and the editor wanted to clean up the house. Obviously, he had the mandate, and he wanted to establish sort of, ethics-based journalism after the 1990s, which was a very clearly a decade of corruption in media. But it was a very tough job in this dirty environment. You didn't know where to start from. So he gave me not only a column, he gave me a full page. So I had for about a year a full page, and it was very easy to fill that page until he was replaced by another editor who was much less interested in this function. So after about 5 hard years of efforts, I was sacked by the owner of the media group, because he thought the way I criticized in a column a clear case of fake news on Kurds, it would jeopardize his relations with the then powerful chief of staff, the military. And it was the first case ever in the world of ombudsman or ombudswomen that an independent public editor was fired doing the job he was paid for. And quickly after, I was hired by another newspaper, a competitive paper, Sabah, and about 7 or 8 years later, I think 8 years later, I was fired again. This time because I found, based on huge wave of reader protests, that the paper had an extremely pro-government biased coverage of Gezi Park protests, which I'm sure you remember from 2013, springtime, May, June. And my 2 consecutive articles were refused to be printed by the editor-in-chief, who also attacked me in public by an article bearing his signature. It was clear that he had been given green light by the proprietor. And infuriated, I penned a big article for New York Times, which New York Times published not only in English, but also in Turkish, because they knew that this article would not be paid attention to. So it landed quite like a bomb in the Turkish media, which quickened my firing, of course. So after 7 or 8 years of legal battle, I was paid damages, but it was a long legal battle. But back to Turkey today. It's no exaggeration, an inferno with respect to freedom, independence, and plurality of media in these 3 dimensions. It's a republic of fear, the coverage of events and publication of reports and comments. Any stage of news production and news dissemination is a problem. Distribution, including distribution of newspapers, etc. Each step full of risks. Freedom House rates Turkey not free for 8 consecutive years now. IPI, International Press Institute, exposed in a report that nearly 94% of the Turkish media is captured by the Erdogan regime, and that portion of 90+% belongs to only 6 families as proprietors. The judiciary from bottom to top, especially on the top levels controlled by the palace, is instrumentalized for punishment of journalists and critical media outlets, be them conventional or digital. Even if the Constitutional Court, rather shy one, in some rare cases ruled in favor of press freedom, those rulings are ignored by the government. So institutionalized oppression has led to an inherent culture of self-censorship. It was existent before, but it's far more now, understandably perhaps from the colleagues' perspective, with the overwhelming majority of newsrooms operating as open-air prisons for decent colleagues, at least. And job security of journalists has always been problematic. It's, the membership of unions in Turkey is only 8%, 7 or 8%, which explains also why self-censorship is so high. Now, to the context of public editor in this environment, there were, before ombudsmanship, 2 mechanisms in Turkey for sort of self-regulation and regulation. One was press council, which had issues from its very inception. It was established in '86 with a small group of elderly journalists, senior ones, but there were deep personal feuds between the launcher of the press council and the Turkish Journalists Association, and it haunted the entire adventure of the press council. It was never recognized properly. It was never taken seriously, and practically it's existent, but practically it's non-existent in Turkey. Secondly, as part of the deregulation of audiovisual media, Radio TV Supreme Board, RTUK, was established in '94. It is the Turkish state agency for monitoring, regulating, and sanctioning radio and television broadcasts. But it's composed of 9 members elected by the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. So, understandably, given the majority of AKP with its partner, nationalist partner, it became a pure punishment mechanism. Its majority constantly abuses its powers to keep the critical media in line. 2000 or 2006 or 7, when I was working as news ombudsman for Sabah Daily, I was invited by the then chairman of the RTUK to a meeting. And there were several board members there and some colleagues from TV channels, private TV channels. The chairman of the board told me that they were considering, as RTUK, a demand to be issued to all the TV channels, force them to establish their own ombudspersons. What did I think of it? I said, it's ridiculous, unacceptable that you are sort of exercising external pressure to, you have no right to impose private media companies to this decision. He didn't like the answer, but companies fearing oppression, appointed these ombudspersons. At one time, there were 18 of them, but all of them were also active editors in the newsrooms, so there was clearly a conflict of interest. It was a joke, and intention became quite clear shortly after. They took direct contact with these ombudspersons whenever RTUK wanted some content censored or bent or shaped. So it basically extended its tentacles to private media. And of course, yes. Okay, I will conclude. So this was clearly one of the strange cases. At one point, to conclude, the top, there were about 6 of us, Sabah, Milliyet, Star Zaman, Cumhuriyet, etc. But we didn't really note success in this kind of culture because it was extremely vertical and polluted with the state ideology, etc. So they saw the ombudsman as nuisance, as my colleagues also told you. So in a few cases, maybe I should go to the conclusion, to note that there was also one ombudsman, not only, I mean, firing of ombudsman was a case, there was also one lately, after the coup attempt, one ombudsman jailed for aiding and abetting terror. It was the public editor of Cumhuriyet. He spent nearly 2 years in jail before being released. So, in conclusion, in developing democracies under threat everywhere now, like Putin, Orban, Erdogan, others like them, engineering media to their favor, we face growing challenges. Oppression forces priorities to change in the media. So the discussion about ethical concerns, bringing up ethical concerns becomes sort of redundant in such oppressive environments. So I think we must intensify the fight for a properly functioning judiciary, pro-freedom judiciary, for preserving constitutional rights and protect our venues as independent media against all evil forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Yavuz. I think we're getting a picture that this is not a job for the faint-hearted. The last two stories didn't end well, so I'm hoping Carl's going to cheer us up.
I am not. It's great to hear and to see everybody. I mean, there's such interesting big questions posed by what everybody's talking about here. We're living at a time of intense strain in terms of trust of media, and we're getting rid of one of the mechanisms that are supposed to promote that trust, and why is that? There's also a kind of like, in all of these discussions, there's almost a kind of like, there's no villain in the story, but I think there is. I mean, it's not like these public editors disappeared into the ether. The news organizations got rid of them. There was an active decision by the editors and the publishers that this was not important. And now there's a handful of public editors in the United States. And you have, you know, we talked about Margaret Sullivan, who is and was terrific in that role. In a way, she probably did it too well. She got so under the skin of the New York Times. The person who replaced her was actually my predecessor as the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, and then it was done. The response of the paper was, well, we're going to now use Twitter as our mechanism, which is laughable on its face, and even more laughable given news today, where the editor of the Times put out a statement saying, we need everybody to back off of Twitter. Twitter's not a good place to have a proper discussion, which we could have all told him when he said that. So I come at this very much as an outsider. I run a journalism review that aims to both advocate for the press and serve as a watchdog of the press. And we noticed this happening and said, well, this doesn't seem to be good for journalism. So in a somewhat, I admit, sort of cheeky move, we said, well, we're going to now be your public editor. So we're gonna now name our own public editors for these places, some of these places, and we called them the public editor, and they started writing columns, sort of along the lines of what these folks would write, and the response was super interesting to me. Uniformly, we focused initially on the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, and CNN. And for the most part, the news organizations were furious. Literally, I had to go into one of the television networks and listen to them say, how dare you do this? How dare you use this name? You can't, because we were calling ourselves, we're the MSNBC public editor. And they said, you have no right to use our name, you have to stop. And we said, no, thank you. And they were incredibly hostile. And it just speaks to the thinness of the skin. And that, I think, is something we really need to spend a half a second talking about, because I think it's related to, excuse me, at least in the US, and I have a feeling it's like this everywhere, or in a lot of places, this sense that journalism and journalists are under threat, which is real, but the way we respond is that we huddle together. The way we respond, and literally there was a documentary made about the New York Times on Showtime, and there's literally a scene where they have their arms around each other, and they're sort of in a huddle. And it was because Trump or somebody had said something awful about journalists. But there is this sense that, like, how dare you attack us when our profession is under attack? How dare you? You're putting individual journalists under threat. I don't think that's how transparency works. I don't think that's how holding people to account is supposed to work. But that's definitely the view now, and it's the view among senior people in the biggest news rooms in our country, and I think around the world. So, and we've since sort of tweaked and changed and adapted this, and it is hard to have these roles when you don't, these aren't. We would hire contract freelance writers who would do this for a while, and then we get other things and move on. So there's flaws in this setup, but I really think we have to understand, especially going into what I think is going to be a really, really, really nasty domestic political scene in the U.S. in the next few years. How open are these media organizations going to be to criticism and change?
That's really fascinating, Kyle. I wonder if I can just get you to muse a bit about the problem which I think is at the heart of this, is the story we tell to the public is that we are the media that you can trust, and if you read it in my newspaper, it's true, as opposed to being a bit more humble about what journalism is. You've all heard me quote this, my favorite paragraph on journalism, which was by David Broder, who was a veteran columnist. And this was his description when he won the Pulitzer Prize. I would like to see us say over and over again till the point has been made that the newspaper that drops on your doorstep is a partial, hasty, incomplete, inevitably somewhat flawed and inaccurate rendering of some of the things we had heard about in the past 24 hours. And he added, if we labeled the product accurately, we could immediately add, it's the best we could do in the circumstances, and we'll come back tomorrow with a corrected and updated version. And that has always seemed to me so true, and it always gets a laugh amongst journalists who say, yeah, that is what journalism is. But it seems to me what you're describing is people who can't bear to admit that that is what journalism is. They want people to believe that journalism is perfect.
They think there is a view now that we can't, that admitting flaws or admitting imperfection gives an opening to what is legitimately a massive cabal of news sites and people with bad actors who are trying to sort of like show the flaws in journalism and why it shouldn't be trusted. So there's like give no quarter is sort of the attitude right now, and it's not healthy. Also, I think we need to acknowledge that like because the distrust of big media, especially in the US but everywhere, is so intense, this setup of having the media organization pay the salary of the public editor for a lot of the public is not going to work. It's just not, it's not a setup that's going to engender trust, because they think the whole enterprise is suspect. And so no matter how courageous these people are and how ethical they are, it's going to be a huge number of people who are going to say yes, but they're still part of the same machinery.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
I'm just kind of.
You can't bite the hand that feeds you syndrome.
I'll just read the opposite. There was a play called Pravda, which was by David Hare and Howard Brenton 30 years ago, which was really about Rupert Murdoch. And a character in that, the editor says, if every time we got something wrong we published a correction, then a newspaper would just be a footnote to yesterday's newspaper. A newspaper isn't just a scrap of paper, it's something people feel they have to trust. And if they can't trust it, why should they read it? And I think that that attitude, but Anna, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the fact that I think something that we haven't said is that the public editor's role could be more a role to help also media literacy. I don't know if you say media literacy, you say digital literacy, but I think we also need media literacy, which means explaining what newspapers are all about. What you just read, I mean, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful way to explain what newspapers were in the past and what, people don't understand what newspapers are nowadays because they're legacy media that don't make any sense to people nowadays who communicate in a different way and get information in a different way. So until newspapers exist, I think newspapers really need to explain what they are and how they work, how they function. Like it's like being in the kitchen, like the public editor should bring the readers in the kitchen to showing how the menu is made, how it's cooked, and what the tricks are, what spices are used by the journalists, what do they do to make it happen every day and come out every day, as imperfect as it is. Because I totally get the frustration of journalists, because I'm a journalist, so I know, and I get the frustration of journalists who make mistakes with the best of intentions, and because that's the way work is, it happens. But what I do think the conscience of journalists should be wanting to correct the error, to look better, because for their credibility, it's better to be transparent and correct. When they try to shove the dirt under the carpet and pretend they didn't make an error. I mean, in Italy, there's this thing, the letters to the editor always have a reply by the journalist, where the journalist gets to reply. But the reply to the reply never exists.
This has all been so fascinating, and I've been a hopeless chair because we've now got 6 minutes left, and it would be ironic for us to be talking about public editors and not allow anybody else to speak. So you might have to come up here to
and turn the microphone on.
So we've got two questions, which may be all that we have time for, but come up and. You may have to take your mask off, because with that Anna Scottish accent, no one will understand you.
Turn the microphone on.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Ewan McCaskill. Alan was my editor for about 2 decades. Kyle, I'm embarrassed to say I wasn't aware of this alternative ombudsman. Is the aim to embarrass the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC into reappointing public editors, or do you see this as a sort of full-time alternative? And Kathy, you mentioned the need to rethink. Did you have something in mind, or was this just a hope?
I'm still working on it. I'll let Kyle go first.
Well, no, you go first, Kathy, and then Kyle.
Okay.
But if you can be 1.5 minutes each, 'cause then we'll have.
Okay, I'll be quick. Rethinking, I think that the fierce independence, that it has to be appointed either by the board or the CEO. It can't be someone who's reporting to the editor, and that the corporation, the owners have to have a really strong commitment to a public editor who is going to do the job independent of the newsroom, and just no matter how much they don't like it, they just have to. Whether Kyle's right and that's just not possible, I don't know, but it needs to be communicated. The independence of the role is critical.
Kyle.
I mean, the Columbia Journalism Review has been around for 60 years doing press criticism. So if they all tomorrow get on board on this, we're still going to do press criticism. We might just call it something else. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they're going to do it. So I don't think our stance is going to change.
So.
Hello, my name's Max Edwards. I'm editor at Bellingcat. You made some interesting points about the role of social media nowadays. It seems that for a long time, people saw the price of being involved in public life as being heckled in a way that lots of journalists are now used to becoming on Twitter. And that seems that we have a kind of interesting cognitive shortcut where people feel, well, I'm being heckled on Twitter, so why would I want one of my colleagues essentially doing the same, if with better intentions? When I work for a small newsroom, we have 30 staff, and the role of the public editor is something that I think for a lot of independent media we would love to have, but we would see it as a kind of vestige of social media editor, and I wanted to know, like, what do you think are the risks of that? I know they're manifold, but I'd like to hear you extrapolate a bit on what you think the specific risks of that are, and if there is any funding model, be it maybe journalists' unions, funding public editors, freelancers, for example, having some kind of roster, where newsrooms like mine could maybe benefit from that in a more structured way.
That is a great question, and people are making alarming sort of throat-cutting signals, which I think means that we've got about 2 minutes in which to answer them. So, Anna, save me from having my throat cut. It's really about really what you were touching on about how social media social media editor is replacing the idea of a public editor.
Yeah, I mean, that's what New York Times has done, but that's what also La Stampa has done. Frankly, to be honest, I don't see what Kathy is saying as the ideal for the public editor being independent, having the publisher as the boss and not the editor-in-chief. I don't see that happening, so I think it's better than nothing to be social media manager who behaves also as public editor in terms of answering and making journalists accountable, because journalists don't like to be accountable. So that's what the social media manager and the public editor should do. I mean, if there is no public editor in terms of the classic role of the legacy media, let it be a social media manager who behaves in a transparent and ethical way and answers. That's just answering to the readers is already a very huge step towards being ethical and transparent and accountable. And I think that's huge. I mean, actually, it's an act of humility, coming down and saying, we made a mistake, we're going to correct it. Thank you for telling us about the mistake. We enjoy, we enjoy constructive criticism and making the conversation between readers and journalists civil, because right now it's not. In Italy, it's not. Journalists are wearing the helmet when they go on Twitter, and they go on Twitter to fight against the readers instead of to ask readers to join them in the conversation. They're there to show off how wonderful they are and to be for the egos and to become huge influencers. They're competing to be influencers instead of being journalists in terms of serving the readers. I mean, I thought we chose our profession to be journalists in terms of being of service and making it. I think of this profession as a very ethical profession in terms of like being a nurse or a teacher. I think journalists should rediscover that kind of service in their profession instead of being influencers or being big, huge stars in the media business. And I mean, there's a few stars, but most of the journalists are not stars. So they may as well be people who are respected by readers because they make themselves respected. This is one of them. So it's important and it's necessary and urgent.
Well, I desperately tried. You could see I tried to get an upbeat evening ending to this evening. Another thing I failed at. But they've been a great panel. Thank you for being a great audience, and thank you for coming along tonight.